Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is going to be the fourth video in this Intro to React 18 series. And basically what's going to happen here is we're going to talk about state. State's probably the trickiest thing for people to appreciate at first with React. But basically the idea is this. State, for the purposes of React, are going to be particular variables that you designate. So you're going to say, hey, this variable is state. And whenever you change that variable in the right way, what's going to do, it triggers the component to re-render. So it rebuilds itself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component just to kind of demonstrate this. First, I'm going to make a new branch. So git checkout -b video 4 will be the branch. Okie dokie. Now let's see here. I will create a new component. We're going to call this, always the best way to kind of get used to working with state is with like a counter. A counter variable. So let's see here, new file. We're going to call this counter.js. And I'm going to just create the skeleton of the function, of the component, props. And I'm going to return h1 that says counter. This is just so I can make sure that the component's working before we get too deep into working with this. Default counter. There we go. We got a basic skeleton component right there. Then I'm going to head back into app.js, just like any other component. I'm going to import counter. And I'm going to just clear out all my JSX here and just replace it with just counter. Okay. And I'm going to get rid of this hello world. Keep this simple. I'm going to run the server. So npm run start. Or npm start, either one's fine. And that starts, and see we have counter. So there's the counter component. Okay. Now, for basically to demonstrate why we need like state is like, let's say I created like a variable. Let's say I said here, like, let's let counter lowercase equal 0, right? And then here in the h1, let's actually wrap this in a fragment. Okay. But let's say I have the h1, and the h1 is instead, it's going to show me what's inside the variable that's called counter. Okay, so that's going to show me the 0. Now what I'm going to want to do is create a button that when you click that button, it's going to cause that number to go up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function. So we'll just say, you know, const, you know, add to counter equals, and it'll just be an arrow function that literally all the function does is just say counter plus equals 1. Okay, so just adding 1 to counter. That's all this function does. Then I'll create a button, and that button will be like, you know, add 1. Now in React, the way you connect a function to something in the HTML is what you do what you would normally do in HTML. So normal HTML, you would typically type in like on click equals, and then you can type in like some JavaScript in parentheses in these quotation marks. But for React, what you do is you do on click camel case, and then what you do equals, and then you'll pass the function in these curly brackets. Okay, basically has an on click prop. There's a prop for pretty much every event you can think of. Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, whenever you click on this thing, I want add to counter to play. Okay, and what I want to do, just to show you that counter is getting updated, every time that this, because again, every time this component updates, it's going to run this console log. Actually, let's actually do that in the function. So let's do this. I'm going to actually add a curly brackets to this function so we can do more than one thing. And we're going to say after each console log, after this, I'm going to console.log counter. So you can actually see like counter changes each time. Okay, so I'm going to open up DevTools, console log Okay, let me just refresh real quick. Okay, now I'm going to click add one. And you see like the console log happens, right? And that variable counter is increasing. So it's like I can manipulate the variable, but my DOM isn't updating. Like the actual visuals aren't updating. The reason being is that the component is not rebuilding itself. Now, again, this is where that whole declarative thing comes into play. Because back in, if I was using jQuery or just plain JavaScript, I would actually have to sit there and like go manually go update that number. So I'd say, okay, the number changed. Let me go grab that DOM element, change its inner HTML or its inner text or its text content to this value. And I would have to kind of do this every time. With React, I don't have to do that. But I do have to designate which variables should trigger an update. Okay, and the way you do that is you have to import what's called a hook. Okay, a hook is going to be any kind of function that starts with the word use in React. So the one we want to import is going to be called useState. Okay, and so that's what the import statement will look like. Import useState from React. And don't forget the curly brackets, because technically what you're doing is you're destructuring it from the big object that React exports. Don't have to worry too much about it. Just know that that's how you export it. So essentially the way this would change is that instead of me creating this counter variable, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, actually, just bring that back so I can just comment it out so you can see the difference. Okay. So instead, what you do is you declare state. And the way that works is you're going to use array destructuring. So I'm going to use square brackets here. And I'm going to first you name the variable, so counter. And then technically the second thing is going to be the function that allows you to change the value of the variable. So we're going to call it set counter. That's typically what you see. You see the variable, then set variable. And then that's going to equal use state, and then use state is going to receive the original value of the state. So in this case, 0. So now in add to counter, instead of doing counter equals plus 1, plus equals 1, I'm going to do set counter and then say set counter should equal, okay, and then technically what you should do is I can do two things. I can just put in the new value, so I could just be here like, okay, it equals counter plus 1. Like that. And then this will work. So if I do this will work. So what's going to happen is that every time I click the button, it triggers this add the counter function, which runs the set counter. And the difference when you do set counter, it changes the value of the variable, but you're not actually changing the variable. What you're doing is you're telling the function to re-render, to rerun the component function. But this time when you run it, the value of counter will be the new value. So in that case, the new output will reflect the new changed value. Okay? So, and you'll see like the variable actually doesn't change. So you see I'm still console logging counter. Okay, but you're going to see like the actual value doesn't change, even though you see a change on the screen. Because technically the variable doesn't change. You're just rebuilding the output, what you see on the screen, based on the new value. So it's essentially you're creating a whole new variable in this new run of the function. Okay, so if I click add 1, okay, see it goes up by 1, but see it console log 0, because I didn't change the value of the variable. You never actually change the value of state. What you're doing is you're saying, hey, on the next time you build this thing, the state's going to start at 1. So then when I click add 1, it's going to happen again. And see, this time it console logged 1, because that console log occurred at on the previous, kind of like, think of it as like you're doing one of those presentations with like little slides and you're clicking the button. Okay, on the previous slide, counter was worth 1, but now we're essentially flipping to a new slide, and essentially the new value is the result of set counter, which is whatever the counter is plus 1. Problem is, if I start clicking this really fast, I might start getting some, interesting results. Okay, you may not want that. Okay, you may, yeah. So what you can do is just kind of make it a little bit safer. Is that instead of just passing the new value, you can pass a function, which I'm pretty sure receives the existing state. So technically, like this would be old counter. And then I could be like old counter plus 1. The reason being is if I click that button fast enough, I may be able to get multiple clicks before certain state changes, and sometimes you get unpredictable results. So what this does, it always makes sure that you're always working off sort of like the old value. So in this case, I'm still doing counter plus 1 essentially, But instead what happens is that the counter is being passed into this function at that time. So now if I do this now, it's still going to do the same thing. Let me refresh. So it's still just going to increment. And notice again, the reason you're seeing the change is because that component is updating every time you run a set state function. So the things that trigger the updates of the DOM is any of these set functions. And again, you can create as many variables as you want. Okay, so let's try something interesting. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a const counter2. So I'll create another state variable. It's going to have its own set function, set counter2. useState. This one will also start at 0. Okay. And then I'm going to give it its own, we'll make another function. Okay, and this will be add counter2. And then this will be using set counter2. So it's essentially the same thing. Okay, and then I'm going to just create another copy of this. Okay, and what we're going to do is make this counter2, add to counter2. But to make this interesting, what we're going to do is we're going to style H. I'm going to do some styling stuff here. So I'm going to say style equals, and then we're going to say color, but I'm going to use backticks. And then what I can do is I can say, let's say RGB, and then we'll just say like 100, 100. And then what I do is that for the last value, we're just going to do counter plus counter 2. So it's going to constantly add, every time the component re-renders, again, it's running this entire logic again. So it's constantly updating everything based on the new values of everything. Okay. And then I will do the same thing on this one, but I'll do the math a little bit differently. Okay, we're going to say counter 1 let's say times counter 2. Okay. So what should happen is that as I change the number of values, you should see the colors of the numbers change over time. Probably just because I'm only changing the last number, so it's not the most visible change. See that one? You can see the change is a little bit more visible because I'm doing like multiplication. Let's do it this way. Let me rebuild this. Let's say counter. Let's make each of these numbers affected by what the number is. In this case, this one will be times counter 2 divided by 10. And then this one will just be to the exponent power. Okay. And let's just watch kind of how the color changes. So refresh. Then I click add. And you see like the colors change because each time I'm rendering, counter and counter 2 are changing. So what's happening in here is changing. And that's the beauty of state. I can name these variables that I know that when they change, there'll probably be some sort of physical change in my application. So I designate them as state using the useState hook. That's all state is. You just think, okay, hey, when this changes, there's going to be a change in which should be visible. So I want to make sure I designate that variable as that. Now, a couple rules. You don't want to ever like set state in the body of the component. So like if I wrote like set state right here in the not like let's say right here on like line 13 where it's like in the body of the function, or on line 19, I'd create an infinite loop. Because what's happening? The component renders, immediately sets the state, which triggers another render, which then immediately sets the state again. Because every time that function runs, it's setting state, so you create an infinite loop. Okay, so generally this is where another hook called useEffect comes in, Where if you need something to kind of happen right away, but you don't necessarily want to create an infinite loop, that's generally where you'll do it. Like for example, let me think of it. Well, right now this isn't the good example to do that with. We'll do it in a future video when we do like API calls and such. But yeah, so basically, to summarize again, state, these are variables that when they change, the component rebuilds itself. And the reason is because something visually should change, or you expect that something should visually change when that variable like changes. The way you do that is you got to import the useState hook. Then you're going to use this syntax to create a state variable. You can create as many as you want. They can be anything. They can be a number, a boolean. They can be objects and arrays. Just be very careful when you're working with objects and arrays. Make sure you have a really solid understanding of the differences between like the whole idea of like passing by value versus passing by reference. Because essentially what's going to happen is that every time you update the state, it does do a comparison. It does check to see, hey, is the new state the same as the old state? And if for some reason they're the same, so for some reason like the number was 0 and then the number was 0 again, it would not rebuild the component. It would not re-render the component, because that would just be a waste of computing power. If it's the same state, then nothing changes. Problem is with objects and arrays, you could have there's two ways that people make a mistake here. You pass the identical array, or an array with the identical elements, but they're still two separate arrays. Because if you create a new array with the same stuff in it, it's still a different array. Every array is unique. Another thing people will do is they'll just push let's say like the state is an array, they'll just push something into the array. But even though there's a new value in the array, it's still the same array. So when they update the state, nothing updates, because technically they're still passing the same array as the state. So again, the contents of the array has changed. It's kind of like me putting in a new couch in my house. Yeah, there's a new couch in my house, but it's still the same house. So just because what it contains is different doesn't necessarily mean the container has changed. And that's what you got to think about, like objects and arrays, that they're containers. And the thing is that state is only looking at like, what did you pass it? So if I pass it an object, it's checking, hey, is it the same object? Not does the object have the same contents? Which is why oftentimes it's easier just to make a individual piece of state for each primitive value. Although there are situations where you use an object or an array as state, but you can use anything. But just so you're aware, again, it's going to check to see if they're equal each time. So if you're not careful about like equality when it comes to arrays and objects, you can find some pitfalls. But yeah, okay, so again, that's how you declare state. Okay, again, the set function is used to update the state. That's what actually triggers the re-render. And you can write functions, and when you write functions and you want to attach them to a DOM element, you just use this kind of syntax. So in this case, I'm making that button clickable. And yeah, so now you know how to do events in React. They work pretty much just what you would expect. Okay, you just write a function. And because these functions are being used during an event, okay, just like normal JavaScript, when you're working with the DOM, it's going to receive the event object. So if you need to do things like event.prevent default or event.stop propagation, or use like event.current target or something like that, you have access to all of that here still. Okay, that doesn't change. So events don't really change than they were like in just normal run-of-the-mill JavaScript. So keep that in mind. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day. Enjoy. I'll see you all in the next one.